What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 122 days now, I think, and going up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through how I use systematic feedback loops in order to build smarter, faster, and avoid waste. So, we're going to be going through the trap of random execution, how that ultimately destroys momentum, and also the progress that you're building within your internal systems and also processes as well, and then going into designing a feedback loop that ultimately compounds, because I think this is one of the most important modes to build a feedback loop that ultimately compounds through time and ultimately acts as leverage within your specific business use case, and also where the real gains actually come from. So just taking a deep dive in terms of where the gains come from that are not super obvious but are also your hidden leverage and your hidden modes, if you will, and also why this compounds, basically the compounding signals that come as a result from the real gains that you're then able to formulate from these feedback loops that you're then able to build. And then ultimately your takeaway, or just final takeaway that I ultimately implemented, and some key things that you can also use to get started. So the trap of random execution. So most builders work slow without structured feedback, and that ultimately results in slow progress. If there are no mechanisms in terms of how you're then able to structure your feedback that you're ultimately able to have in terms of your current builds and also your client work as well, then you're not able to scale your operations and the way that you're able to then build, because the progress that you ultimately have, it becomes slow simply because the processes are not super clear. You don't have a structured method in terms of gathering feedback and then implementing that feedback that ultimately allows your progress to move faster, and this ultimately becomes a constraint. Slow progress ultimately becomes a constraint because you only move as fast as your constraint, and if your progress is super slow, then your constraint means that you're not moving as fast as you possibly can. And in business, speed is key. So ultimately taking that approach of how can we then have these structured feedback loops that ultimately allow us to then increase the progress that we're making on a day-to-day basis, or even an hourly basis if you want to get super granular, or if you want to get more granular on an hour, on a minute, and also a second basis. How can we just make sure that we're structuring our feedback loops in a manner that constantly allows us to compound and also increase the progress that we're making on a day-to-day? And also understanding that ideas build up and pile up, but you don't know what actually moves the needle. So this is separating noise from signal, understanding what are the things that are true that actually move the needle versus the things that sound nice and are nice to haves but ultimately don't move the needle, and how are you then able to focus on the things that actually do move the needle and order and use those things to ultimately compound, and that becomes your moat, basically your compounding leverage that you then able to then build through time. How are you then able to structure it in a manner that ultimately compounds, and understanding that not all ideas are always going to work, but how can you separate the ideas that actively do work and are beneficial for the business long term versus the ones that are nice to have, or basically are noise that sound good in the short term but hurt your brand in the long run, and ultimately don't compound as well. And also time and energy is wasted on solutions that don't scale or matter. So basically focusing on tasks that ultimately do not scale your level of output, because if you're not able to scale your level of output on a day to day, then ultimately it means that you cannot scale your level of impact that you'll have for the services or the product that you're ultimately providing. And that ultimately means that you're also not focusing on the things that actually matter. So these are the things that move the needle on a day-to-day basis, and understanding how to basically separate the things that don't really make that progress, or rather move the needle, versus the things that actively do move the needle on a day-to-day basis. So how can we then use this to basically design the feedback loops that ultimately compounds? And for me, I like to take it an approach of you always have your inputs, you have your processes, and you have your outputs. So if we look at this, we basically see the outputs, in my specific use case, so these are daily videos, client builds, and side projects or side experiments. So these are the daily videos that I'm actively, building on a day-to-day basis in order to build, the grand vision for what it is that we're, ultimately gonna build into the future, and using these as a documentation mode that ultimately allows us to see where we went wrong, what we were thinking in this present moment in time, and how we're gonna scale our efforts into the future, as well as client builds, so active client builds that we're actively, building on, and also the side experiments, so basically side quests, if you will, so the different side experiments that we would ultimately run as a result from this, and just taking an approach of what are the things that we are doing on a day to day that ultimately, enable the inputs that we're having, and how are we then able to move these inputs and understand, the processes that we ultimately do have. And this ultimately comes down to the reflection and iteration frameworks that we ultimately have. So these are end of day notes, what worked, what didn't work, and the metrics tracked, because this is one of the most important things to ultimately understand what are the things that we're doing on a day to day that ultimately work, and what also has failed, so that we're then able to document that and also use that as a mode to build better and also scale our efforts in terms of our impact that we'll have into the future. And that is also super important to solely just understand what are the processes looking like in terms of what worked, what didn't work, and how can we also track these metrics. And I speak about this a lot in terms of my videos of just tracking metrics and seeing what worked, and also understanding the data, because those different data points are ultimately going to become your advantage points that you can ultimately use as a competitive mode. So if you're gathering as much data as you possibly can, then you're then able to understand, what are the things that, are going to move the business forward, not just today, but into the future as well. Because then you do pattern recognition, where you're then able to understand from this data that you've been able to gather, what are the patterns, this data is showing us, and how would these patterns be, moving into the future, and how can we then predict how to move into the future. Because if you don't have data, you're not going to know what patterns, truly exist in what's going on today, that ultimately allows you to predict what's going on tomorrow. And this ultimately comes, from reflection as well, in my experience, that, you have to have these processes where you have end of day notes, what did you achieve, what did you not achieve, and what worked, what didn't work, and how can you build better or move better into the next day. Because if you're not actively doing this on a day-to-day basis, then you're not going to, have the level of impact that ultimately compounds through these daily actions. And everyone sees, these things as, this only happens, once you get this big win once, but no, it comes as a result of the day-to-day actions that ultimately come as a compounding mode that you're then able to formulate just from taking this approach. At least in my experience, it's just one of those things that you ultimately, build today, and it's going to have a 10x impact into the future. But it doesn't have to be tomorrow, it doesn't have to be next week, it doesn't have to be even be next month, but ultimately understanding that, in the next 6 months, it could possibly have a huge amount of impact. But that also means that we need to make sure that we're understanding the outputs that we want, which are ultimately smarter builds, better decisions, and faster execution. If we're then able to build better decisions in terms of our frameworks that we're using, then we're then able to ultimately build what it is that we're doing more efficiently, simply because we're having better decisions, which ultimately reduce the costs, especially when we're doing client builds, that we understand, hey, we're gonna take this decision of reducing the cost, and how can we actively reduce this, because we've done, we've built these frameworks that we've ultimately have been able to gather simply through this process. And also faster execution, speed is key in business, so it's ultimately understanding how can we move a lot faster in solving problems and also creating value. And understanding that this comes in three parts, which is inputs, understanding the inputs, the client builds, the daily videos, and also the side experiments, and then the processes, what is the in between that, or what is in between that, which are the end end of day notes and what worked, what didn't work, as well as the metrics that we tracked on a day-to-day basis, and as well as the outputs that we're ultimately looking for, which are your smarter builds, better decisions, and faster execution, which are also just as important. So where do the real gains come from? Maybe your next question. So where do the real gains come from? They come from tracking repeated patterns. Then you're then able to create templates and automations. I've spoken about this countless of times on my channel in terms of building these templated approaches that ultimately allow you to then scale your level of impact and your output as well, and also build systems that validate ideas faster. So MVPs, dummy data, Figma mockups, basically building the systems that ultimately validate your ideas quicker than you would if you didn't have this in place, in terms of your feedback loops that's ultimately being backed up by past experiences and also data that you've ultimately been able to gather, and ultimately allows you to build better MVPs, better dummy data, and Figma mockups, because these feedback loops then create a moat like I've been speaking about, which ultimately means that you're improving yourself as well as the business systems. Because it's one thing to just constantly just focus on the business systems, but you as the business owner also need to improve yourself. And how can you do this on a day-to-day basis? By ultimately understanding that feedback loops need to be structured systems in order to create that leverage that ultimately compounds through time. And how are you then able to understand how this compounds? We can take a look at this by understanding the compounding signals, which ultimately means that you're treating every action as an experiment with measurable results. And keyword here is measurable results, or keywords here are measurable results. You need to be able to measure what it is that you're actively doing on a day-to-day basis and the results that you're then able to gather. Because if you're not able to gather results or fully understand what it is that you're doing, then you're not going to be able to back it up or get those data points that you ultimately need in order to understand how to move into the future and why this compounds as well. Because it may be nice to say, hey, this is cool, this works, and it's bringing value, but if you're not tying this or quantifying it, then you're not gonna fully understand the extent or the scope of the level of impact that it ultimately has on your business and also on yourself as well. And being able to break down the builds into smaller units, first principles, so basically understanding what are the things that encompass the elements, what are at the base, and then reasoning up from there to say, hey, this is what's at the base. Now we're asking how can we reason up from there, and why is this the base, and finding what it is that we need to be doing on a day-to-day and seeing what ultimately moves the needle, and understanding that feedback loops ultimately equal shortcuts to knowledge and leverage as well, because you're then able to build this compounding knowledge that you've ultimately built from past experiences, from asking questions as well, which I think is also another huge part of these feedback loops, of just asking questions, asking why, or asking why 5 times, and digging and drilling a lot deeper to ask the questions of why does this exist, and why is this a requirement, if you will, and ultimately understanding that these feedback loops are ultimately a result of knowledge, shortcuts to knowledge that you've ultimately been able to build through past experiences, and also leverage as well. So this is your leverage in terms of building this out in terms of systems, and also scaling your level of output as well. And also understanding the takeaway that I want you to have from this entire video, which is ultimately don't just produce, but rather build a system around production. If you're building, you need to ultimately make sure that you're building in a structured manner. Otherwise, when complexity increases, you're not going to know what is going on. And each day you need to be able to capture a signal, reflect, iterate, and repeat over and over again. And this ultimately means that over time, compounding feedback turns into motion. Over time, compounding feedback turns motion into massive leverage, and this leverage ultimately moves your efforts a lot further than they would if they didn't have this competitive mode, and also building this feedback loop that ultimately turns what it is that you're doing today into the leverage or the means that ultimately allows you to win tomorrow. And taking this approach of basically structuring feedback loops as systems and using them to build smarter, faster, and avoid waste is one of the most important modes. Because if you're then able to, simply avoid waste in terms of understanding and identifying where it is that you're leaking, for example, revenue, then you're then able to understand through these feedback loops how to combat that as well. And asking questions from first principles, I know you guys probably know this. I'm a big a proponent or a big believer in first principles thinking in terms of asking or drilling down to the root of why things are the way that they are and reasoning up from there and ultimately finding a solution through that, and understanding each of the different moving parts and understanding that each of these different parts interact all with each other in all different in some shape or form. But ultimately through that means that we then need to be able to build these feedback loops that ultimately compound through time, not just for today but also for tomorrow. And if you guys like this video, make sure to check out my newsletter that I recently just rolled out. And yeah, also make sure to check out my X, LinkedIn, Instagram as well. The links are all in the description. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this video, I will see you guys in the next one.